this celebration of the feast of Christ the King may seem somewhat archaic and maybe even awkward in our day and age, because most of us don't really appreciate what is being communicated. I think probably for most of us, we can remember reading about we had a revolution to get rid of a king. We didn't want one. And even today, when we hear about a king, for instance, King Charles of England, it's rather a ceremonial role. It's not someone who, within themselves, has a tremendous amount of power. This is not the case with Christ the King, and that's why it has to be explained, and there has to be an application made to how this kingship plays out, how this king rules our lives. We talked about King Charles of England, and many other kings. There's a king in Spain, a king in Belgium, but they are part of what we know to be a constitutional monarchy. In other words, they're subject to the legislative bodies, judicial bodies in their various countries. Not the case with Jesus. It's not a ceremonial role, and it's not a constitutional monarchy. When we talk about Jesus as king, we have to understand what it means in the traditional sense of king. He is the lawgiver, and he is the judge. How's that? King Charles is not the lawgiver, and he's not the judge. Jesus is lawgiver, and he is judge. And that's why tied in with this Feast of Christ the King is the whole idea of judgment. So some of you may remember in some of our churches, and certainly in the Orthodox churches, you would see in the asp of the church a picture of Christ sitting on a throne, maybe a mosaic of Christ on the throne, and he would have a globe with a cross on it in his hand. And that symbolized Christ, the King of all creation, and the judge. We are subject to the judgment of his laws. He is the lawgiver. We don't make the laws of God. We obey the laws of God, and if we don't obey the laws of God, we are subject to judgment. We have that judgment scene in Matthew. Some will go to heaven, and some will go to hell. Now, as I said, for many of us, this is a foreign idea. We're used to voting on everything. We're used to following a culture, political correct culture. And to think that, we are subject to the laws of a king and that there is no arguing with those laws and there's no changing of those laws, no matter how unpopular they may be. That certainly should be for us something that is awesome, maybe frightening, and maybe it's one of those things that tells us who we really are. Are we Christians, or are we just going along for the ride? Christians have always had to take a stand and risk being unpopular and risk their lives. Let's go back to the early days of the church. The church challenged the Roman Empire. Take a couple of examples. The Romans were used to putting babies out that they didn't want. And they would leave them out in the elements to die. If the baby was not what they wanted, you could put the baby out there to die. We're not too far away from that today, are we? Things haven't changed very much. But even the gladiatorial contests. The church spoke out against the killing of babies. The church spoke out against the gladiatorial contests. The church was persecuted for it. They challenged the culture of the time. And many gave their lives for it. Let me talk to you about something that's happening right now. And we are dealing with a challenge to God's law and a challenge to religious freedom, which is given to us by God and guaranteed in our Constitution, the First Amendment. Some of you may have been hearing about a piece of legislation. It went through Congress, and now it is gone through the House, and it's gone through the Senate. It's called the Respect for Marriage Act. It's certainly misnamed if you're a Christian. It's not respecting marriage as the church knows marriage to be. Marriage is between a man and a woman. Respect for Marriage Act says it will be codified into the law of the land that any marriage between two men, two women, and as I read the law, it could be more than two people, that this would become the law of the land. It's disrespect for Marriage Act according to God's plan. We know God's plan from Scripture. Marriage is between a man and a woman. We know God's plan from the natural law. We know God's plan from the teachings of the Christian church throughout the centuries. I'm not just talking about the Catholic Church. I'm talking about the Christian churches. They have always taught that marriage is between a man and a woman. Now, all of a sudden, there's going to be a law that's going to be the law of the land, that we must respect and cooperate with something that we deem to be evil. It's evil. How many are speaking out against it because it is contrary to God's law? It is contrary to Christ the King, lawgiver and the judge. How many will say souls are at stake? Very few. And many of the churches have capitulated. Some churches say, we're welcoming communities now. Whatever you want, that goes over here. We want to be politically correct. They have given up the faith. They are no longer to be called Christian. Period. End of the sentence. But this Respect for Marriage Act even goes further. It is an attack on religious liberty. So that, as it is written at the moment, there is only a very narrow window that would allow the churches to preserve the ceremonies that establish the sacrament or the rite of marriage compared to what the church does otherwise. So, very narrow. It only allows for the ceremony itself to be guarded. And that means that I, or some other pastor, maybe a Protestant church, or a rabbi in an Orthodox community, would not be subject to performing a same-sex marriage. That's as narrow as it is right now. But there are greater implications. The implications are that it will affect what we call para-church organizations. For instance, Knights of Columbus, St. Vincent de Paul Society, schools, hospitals, adoption, foster care, church-sponsored housing. And if we did not or do not go along with that, we are subject to prosecution. Not only can individuals challenge us, but so can the United States government challenge us. And that is an offense not only against God, it's an offense against the Constitution of the United States. It limits religious freedom, it limits our freedom of speech. It passed the Senate this past week. 12 votes were given by Republican senators, and that will avoid a filibuster. Some are trying to add a few more amendments to protect religious freedom. It's not over yet, but it's very close to being over because it goes back to Congress. I have already had a discussion with one of our congressmen about his vote. Don't be afraid to challenge our elected officials. They represent us. And of course, when I speak to them, it's always, well, we can always correct it before it gets final passage. I don't think so. Because you know what happened with Obamacare and the Little Sisters of the Poor. The Little Sisters refused to put abortion and contraception into their health care plan. And they've been persecuted, not prosecuted, persecuted by the courts for a number of years now. It goes on and on and on. This respect or disrespect for Marriage Act is one of the examples of a society that has gone secularist, that has forgotten about God's laws, has forgotten about Christ the King, and has forgotten about the judgment that each and every one of us is going to be subject to. We have an obligation as Christians to speak the truth. Last week we heard in the gospel that for those who follow Christ, there will be persecution. Ladies and gentlemen, persecution is upon us. Persecution is upon us. No matter how many amendments they place on this Disrespect for Marriage Act, Christians will be persecuted. Where do you stand? You stand with a secularist society, or do you stand with Christ the King? Let me tell you just a brief story. I think it's so inspiring. In the last century, the beginning of the last century, the early 1900s up till about 1926, Mexico was taken over by a secularist government. Every secularist government is atheist. And the church was under persecution. The churches were closed. Priests and religious sisters could not wear their habits in the street. And the sacrifice of the Mass was banned. A movement rose among the people like you, and some priests. And they called themselves the Cristeros, the Christ movement. And they did everything they could to make sure that the truth of the gospel was preserved and that the sacraments were celebrated. It's not too far away from us. Even in Canada, Christians are being challenged. You might say, it was 100 years ago in Mexico. Can it happen to us here? And the answer is yes, it can. Yes, it can. It can happen anywhere when Christians do not stand their ground and speak the truth. There was one priest who I have a very special devotion to in Mexico, Father Miguel Pro. Father Miguel Pro is a Jesuit priest. He was studying in Europe and he went back to Mexico knowing the danger that there was in going back. He administered the sacraments. He taught the faith. And finally, he was captured. He was brought before a firing squad. Stretched out his hands as they were aiming the rifles at him, and he shouted, "Viva Cristo Rey! Long live Christ the King!" Where do you stand? You stand with a secular society? You stand with the politically correct? You stand with those who are willing to risk their immortal souls to be popular? Or do you stand with Christ the King? Join me now. Viva Cristo Rey! Viva Cristo Rey. Viva Cristo Rey. Viva Cristo Rey. God love you.